Okay, right. So today we have a talk by Stephanie Burton from the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences and Future Africa, University of Pretoria. And the title of the talk is Are Scientists Being Heard? And Stephanie will share her perspective on the S20 Science Forum. But before that, a couple of announcements. First of all, I welcome new members of the Society, Professor Siobhan Reynolds from the School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences, University of Witwatersrand, and Dr. Matt Jeffrey Lauter, a senior lecturer in archaeology in the University of Witwatersrand. Welcome. Second, we have full clarity on the next three webinars of the Royal Society. Well, first of all, on the 18th of June, Professor Fadil Essop, Fellow of the Royal Society from the Division of Medical Physiology at Stellenbosch, will give a talk on technique to thought, expanding the horizons of STEM postgraduate training. On 17th September, Peter Vale, a political scientist, will be giving a talk on polemics, pamphlets, and prattle. The International came to South Africa. And finally, on the 18th of October, Dr. Martin Becker, computational social scientist and AI ethics researcher, lecturing in ethics and social science at the School of Electronic and Information of Engineering at WITS, will be talking on artificial intelligence. Okay, with that, I move to the talk today. As I said, Professor Stephanie Burton, and Stephanie is a professor in biochemistry and a former vice principal for research at the University of Pretoria. She is also appointed as an honorary professor in biochemistry at the Rhodes University. She lectured at Rhodes, at UCT, served as a director of the Biocatalysis and Technical Biology Group at Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and her research interests are in biocatalysis and applied biochemistry. Stephanie is the immediate past president of the Royal Society of South Africa, and she has served as a member of the council and as interim president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. During 2024, Stephanie represented Academy of Sciences at the S20 Science Forum meetings hosted by Brazil, and she co-chaired the National Organizing Committee for the S20 Science Forum being hosted by South Africa in 2025 in association with the 2025 G20 Summit. She's also a member of the steering committee of the 2025 G20 Initiative on Bioeconomy. With that, Stephanie, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody who's online. I am going to use a PowerPoint presentation, so I will share my screen in a moment, but let me just say thank you to the Royal Society for this opportunity. It's a little novel for me. I've spent quite a lot of time doing the introductions that Igor's just done, but delivering the talk, of course, is a little different. So let me share my screen and hope that it comes up. Can I just have somebody confirm that you can see? You can see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, in presentation mode.
Right.
Oh, now it says my screen sharing is paused. So if I change slides, does that work?
We still see the first slide.
Okay, I'm going to just stop sharing and start again then. There's something a little odd.
Right, we see your title slide.
But it doesn't seem to. Okay. And has that just changed?
No, it's still on the title page.
Okay, there's a problem. Okay, we'll try one more time.
Okay. We see the title slide.
Yeah. Okay, now if I go to slideshow, that's the title. Now, if I move to the next slide, that
Right.
worked.
I think something is changing, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, good. All right. I'm sorry, I have no idea. But you know, there's a stress detector in Zoom. Okay, so this is the title of what I'm going to talk about today. It's really because there's been a lot of discussion around the G20 and S20 meetings, and I thought it would be useful to talk about science communication in this context. So the first thoughts that come to mind are this, first of all, this idea of should we be being listened to? And you know, when I start talks like this, I ask people who are close collaborators or close to me, do you think scientists should be informing policymakers? And they all say, of course. And they should be there because those policies that we hear about need to be founded on evidence. And we as scientists think that that will assist with the plans for the future and with policy for the long term. So there's this general view that we should be integrating science into policy, so that we do provide for more resilient and sustainable societies. But there's a debate going on about whether scientists are actually heard by policymakers, and it varies tremendously across regions and contexts. One of the quotations that I think is really relevant to this is this one, which says that science is as much an act of persuasion as it is an act of discovery. And I think that's what this talk is really about, is how do we use our abilities to persuade as well as to actually discover new knowledge. So the first question I think we need to ask, if we're thinking about are we being listened to, is who is listening? And this is a diagram which actually comes out of the COVID era, and it was focused on the World Health Organization, but it's very relevant. The people who are listening are a varied group. There's government, and there are other scientists, and there's the media, of course, and social media, and everybody else who's in the community leaders, scientists who are writers and so on. So we have a very varied audience, and we need to think about where the voice of the scholarly community is being heard. I'm going to start by giving two examples of communication where the communication has been critical in the events that have taken place. And the first one, of course, is the COVID pandemic. And I'm referring here to the COVID-19 country report, which is a report written largely coordinated by the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, but it was written initially in 2022, 700 pages of it, and then more recently a consolidated second edition is about to be launched now. That COVID country report has lots of different chapters, lots of different aspects of what was in it. This is just a copy of the content page of the first edition. And the second edition, which is consolidated, is pretty similar. But the point that I want to make about it is that it's a very broad report. It includes consideration of communication and responses from civil society and from social groups and from the government. So what it did at the time was to provide a story. It recorded what was happening, but the measures that were adopted by the government, and how people handled, for example, managing the effects, particularly on vulnerable groups. And the intention, the point of it, was to serve as a reference point, to provide some lessons in what we had learned through the COVID experience. And the communication was a key part of it. The first edition had a discussion of what had happened with the communications strategy and the various stages of the pandemic. And the second edition looked quite deeply into recommendations for consideration about how research was used, what was the impact on the government's capacity to communicate, how the experience of scientists was in communicating and taking the information to the community, and how was it taken up by decision makers. And there was also some discussion about the problem of access to information. So all of that tells us that, and I'm sure you remember, we had some leaders scientific leaders who were very prominent during the COVID time on television, in the media, telling us what was happening. And those experiences helped scientists to realize how important it is to communicate the scientific information and how much the public depended on it. So the lessons that we learned from that about what worked well, not everything worked well, but there was evidence that, well, it was clear that the scientific information was recognized by the political leadership and was taken up, and their steps were dependent on what they had from the scientific community. There were a lot of other things that came out of the COVID country report as well. I was responsible only for the chapters on communication, but there was a lot of information that came out of it. But when it was presented to Cabinet, the communication strategy and the crisis communication plan were recognized as being coherent, reliable, credible, and available to the population. And it did come in. We did deliver it in different languages and different media and so on. So out of those recommendations in the report, there was quite a lot about things like we need more central coordination and disaster management centers and to strengthen our accountability and so on. But it also, one of the recommendations was that there should be better coordination on the communication of legislation between leaders and between different spheres of the public because of the confusion which arose. So the recommendation that I wanted to highlight in all of this is the one that said what should happen is that we should be appointing more experts to different advisory structures and to provide for a broad spectrum of experts to provide those perspectives. So the message there is that the government is listening to the importance of having experts providing advice. We know now, of course, that the government did rely on scientists in that time of crisis, and the public appreciated the information. And there were processes of feedback which showed that communication report is in fact a useful document now for the government to consider when the next big disaster takes place. So there's one example of the government listening to the voices of the scholarly community. Here's the next one, climate change. The discussion in the general media about climate change has been, to some extent, who should be talking about it? What do they know? What evidence is there? What can we do? What should we be doing? And I'm going to take the liberty now of using the example of one individual who is a colleague who I know, who is at the University of Cape Town. Peter Johnston is a climate scientist, and he researches climate and is able to talk about climate change with authority. This is one of the articles that he published recently in The Conversation, but he is very often interviewed on television, on the radio. There are frequent messages on YouTube, which have been recordings of Dr. Johnston talking about, for example, extreme weather events. Just recently, he also wrote another article. There was another article written about climate change and adaptability that was in News 24. The point I want to make about this is that the public really do listen to credible experts. And this is one example of a credible expert who has become well known because he's able to explain various different aspects of climate change. He did recently, in one of his articles, link the fact that the government has prioritized in the G20 presidency issues around things like food security related to climate change as well. So with climate change, it's absolutely critical that the information that is provided is correct. And there's no shortage of data And there's no shortage of reporting. There are many different organizations, and this is the South African perspective on that. Lots of data available from various different organizations, the Weather Service, the National Climate Change Information System, biodiversity organizations, geographical, meteorological organizations. So there's lots of data there. But what do we do about it? There's also a lot of data that comes even more broadly on the international scene. So Earth observation, this is the NASA example. There's the International Monetary Fund. There's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. There's the World Health Organization. There's the Climate Change Knowledge Portal. And of course, there's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So here, what we have is a deluge of information. And the question is, what do you do about that? How do you manage all that information? And there we turn to the policymakers. So in South Africa, we have a government climate change response fund, which has been established in 2024, and a Climate Change Act. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but the message is that our policymakers are listening to the evidence about climate change and putting in place some responses. Going to take time, and there's a lot of decisions to be made. But the point is our policymakers are listening to the evidence that's being provided to them. And on the international scale, of course, there are many international agreements and commitments. So, for example, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, which has been going for some years now. But there's also many agreements. The Kyoto Protocol was a while ago, the Rio Agreement, this one most recently, the Paris Agreement, which is it's a legally binding treaty on climate change and how nations should be responding to that. It's a bit of a landmark, that, because it has brought in commitment from countries who have signed on to it. And then, of course, one of more recent trends has been the attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, which again relate back in many cases to climate change. So there's responses from government organizations and global organizations about looking at the data and considering what the scientists are telling them. So those are two examples where the evidence is huge and there have been policy-making decisions and the public have been informed through some of that evidence. Now let's talk about the G20. The G20, there's a summit, which is called the G20 Summit, and there's the S20 Science Forum. So the G20 Summit is a meeting of the leaders of the G20 countries. And the G20 countries, it's the group of 20. They are 19 countries, the European Union and the African Union, and they form a forum to discuss global issues. And South Africa in 2025 has taken on the presidency of the G20 Summit and has a theme of fostering solidarity, equity, and sustainable development. So that G20 works through an agenda which the presidency steers. So South Africa this year, steering the G20 agenda and hosting a summit towards the end of the year. In the G20, there's two tracks. There's a finance track and a Sherpa track. The Sherpa process is one where individuals who are appointed by the national leaders become an emissary, a messenger, to coordinate discussions around various aspects of what are important. I'm going to go into the topics in a moment. And then there's a finance track where the finance ministers and their appointees discuss economic issues. Within those tracks, there are working groups, thematically oriented working groups. You'll see now, this is how bureaucracy gets very complicated. But the working groups are representatives appointed by the leaders, representatives of governments, government departments, and then organizations who are invited to be a part of that. And those working groups meet regularly throughout the year and discuss agenda items that should then be provided for the national leaders at the summit, so that the working groups feed into the G20 leaders meeting at the end of the year. And then in addition to that, there are engagement groups which bring together different sectors of the population, civil society, parliamentarians, various groups, including researchers. So those engagement groups have their own set of discussions. The working groups are, just to summarize, really a part of the government structures, and the engagement groups are somewhat independent. But they all are discussing issues of what is important for the G20 group. And the participation of those stakeholders is in our this year in our South African presidency has been given a lot of prominence, and a commitment that they will be listened to. There are discussions which are going on in a number of engagement groups. This little list of the B20, the C20, the L20, the P20, and the S20, and so on. These are all working groups or engagement groups who are at the moment in a series of discussions about what are the priority issues that our national leaders should be discussing. So representatives of those engagement groups define particular positions, which are then provided. They are independent, they have their own discussion, but their responsibility is to provide those to our the summit, the G20 summit at the end. There is a very informative website, the G20 website, if anybody would like to look at it. It's very comprehensive. Here's an example of how that has happened in the past. And I would like to just acknowledge that this was provided to me by Dr. Albert van Jaarsveld, who was at the time the executive officer of the president of IASA, which is the International Institute for Applied Systems. It's based in Europe. And its work is really around analysis of data. So IASA made a contribution through a series of discussions, provided a series of policy briefs and papers, looking at particular issues that were important and on current in the 2022-2023 period, but focusing on advancing sustainable governance. They looked at particular key areas: pandemics, climate finance, global security, and they then provided these papers, policy briefs, to give input to the G20 and make recommendations which could be actioned across the whole G20 group. Here's what they did produce during that time. This is a series of their policy papers that were provided to the G20, going from the pandemic issues right across to confronting challenges around the global trade, and so on, and climate. And the quotation on this slide was after the event, saying that they were appreciating the fact that the many recommendations in the policy papers did have resonance in the 2023 G20 Leaders Declaration. So the information that IASA had provided to the G20 was taken note of. In other words, here's another example of the G20 members listening to what the scientists were recommending. Here's another example, one which is a work in progress. This is one of the working groups for the G20 in 2025 that we are hosting. And this is one where you heard earlier, I am involved in the steering committee, and that is the G20 Bioeconomy Initiative, which is being driven partly through our Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. And it's focusing on bioeconomy, that's using living organisms or systems to make valuable products. It's an application which spreads across agriculture and health and manufacturing using biologically based technologies. And it's today estimated to be valued at about $4 trillion, but growing as countries see the importance and the relevance of using biologically based technologies. The drivers are things like equity and climate change and environmental issues and health concerns. And there's potential in all of that for growth through job creation, through development opportunities, and taking into account at the same time Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities. So that's at the heart of what a bioeconomy is really about. But it is also a key step in a transition to low carbon, climate resilient, nature positive economies. And this year we have our G20 Bioeconomy Initiative Working Group working on some focus areas which are looking at how do we quantify, how do we measure the bioeconomy in terms of success and relevance and impact? How do we build a bioeconomy in an African context? How do we finance bioeconomies? These things always need some financing to start. And then framing a way of delivering bioeconomy developments in Africa. So those are ambitions, aspirations at the moment, but watch this space. There will be recommendations from this working group that will go to the G20 in 2025. So now let me turn to the Science Forum, the S20, which is, again, South African hosted this year. It's part of the G20 summit, and it is part of the fact that the presidency is being looked after this year by South Africa with that theme. But the S20 Forum is the Science and Technology Engagement Group. So it's intended to provide a way for the scientific community to inform policymakers. And all the way through this year, and it has been the same last year and previous years, the members of the S20 look at relevant topics and formulate particular recommendations. And this year, this is being hosted by our Academy of Science of South Africa. And we have already started. We have already had one meeting, which we had in February, and there will be a further one in September. The S20 then it's a working group, it's an engagement group, and its job is to promote dialogue between the scientific community and policymakers. There's representatives in the S20 who are members of all the academies of the G20 countries. It's a relatively small meeting, and they look at particular relevant topics, and they look at recommendations and actions. So those recommendations go into a document which is called the S20 Communique, and that is then presented to the G20 leaders in due course. So we, as the S20, aim to provide scientific evidence and advice to our heads of state in these communiques or S statements, and each one seeks to address important challenges of the moment. Those reports are published and delivered, so they will be available. And of course, the question comes down to, do the national leaders listen? And when I have spoken about this to colleagues, there's sometimes been some skepticism as to how much people do listen, or the government national leaders do actually listen to what we are saying. There is, in a way of, by way of evidence for that, the Inter-Academies Partnership did a project which I'm going to tell you about now. The Inter-Academies Partnership is a network of some 160 academies, science academies across the world. And this link gives you a link to the report on this project. What that project did was to take a comparative analysis of the themes that the S20 Forum had discussed and the discussions in the G20 Summit and the statements that came out at the end of each of those rounds of discussion. So now this is the project that the IAP did over a 10-year period. So they looked at the reports, the S statements from G7 and G20 Academy meetings. They looked at what had been delivered to the governments in the G7 and G20 summits, and then tried to look for correlations. There's a lot of examples in here, and I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but let me show you very broadly what the project was about. So the project involved taking a look at what had been discussed in the S20 summits and statements, and then looking for themes that had been carried through into the G7 and G20 statements, which came out of the G20 summits. Looking at those involved taking evidence from a 10-year period, 2013 to 2023, looking at the S statements and the G statements, many of them, of course, on different topics, and then categorizing what are those themes and what was in them. So the project divided the topics of conversation into those 6 broad themes or categories: environment, health, socioeconomic, science system, science and society, and technology. And then within those subsections of discussion points or topics that had been included in the discussions. And in order to find some kind of way to analyze that, we did it this way. Taking one of those themes, we looked at, over the 10-year period, what had been discussed in the S forum, the S20 forum. That's the S on the top line of data, along this one, if you can see the mouse, and then what had been discussed in the G20 summit and what had come out in the G20 statements. So this is an example of biodiversity, which of course has been discussed over a very long period by scientists. And you can see in the top line there that it was a priority discussion point almost over the whole of the 10 years. But the G20 summit only really paid attention to it in the last 3 years, where it was a major discussion point. So for each of those trends, each of those themes, the project gave a look at each of the sub-themes and took a look at where the trends were. And I will breeze through these. There's far too much detail for me to discuss in all of them in detail. But the climate change one, for example, is a useful one to look at. It has been on the agenda of the G20 leaders all the way along. And of course has also been a discussion point by the S20. But what's happened is that because it's become such a complicated and such a broad theme, it's now becoming kind of grouped together: climate change, food security, and ocean sectors, biodiversity. So now this is a very predominant trend. And there was a very obvious spike in 2015. That was when the Paris Agreement was set up and the SDGs were agreed. So the trend there is that this has been one where it's been paid attention to by both G20 and S20. Health trends are a little bit different. There's been more discussion over some of the health trends. For example, aging hasn't really had a lot of impact yet in the G20 discussions, but it's something that the S20 group have been discussing a lot. But health equity and access to health has been a predominant factor for the G20 group for some years, and in fact, not quite so much of an emphasis by the S20. And then the neglected tropical diseases was an infrequent feature. It came up over a short period, but hasn't really been sustained. So that's the way in which this project has run, and we have all of these trends and data, and I won't go through them all in detail, but the ones that come out in the socio-economic trends: sustainable development, poverty and economic growth, disaster resilience, have become important, of course, with the disasters that we are seeing. Within the science system, collaboration has been very important as a discussion point in the S20. How do we collaborate? How do we work together? And it has then been emphasized by the G20 as well. And I think perhaps the bottom line on this graph is one of the most important: the R&D funding, which has been of concern to scientific groups all along and is becoming a point of attention for the G20. Science and society, similarly, as I say, these trends deserve a lot more interrogation than I'm going to give them now. But I think that what we're seeing is that there is definitely some correlation between what is discussed in the S20 and what is then discussed in the G20 groups. One that is not not predominant at all in the G20, and I think is interesting, is the issue of ethical research. And watch that space too. The S20 group have been talking about ethics in research for some time. And as artificial intelligence has become more evident, that one, I think, will become more of a concern to the G20 group as well. The last one is the technology trends, and this shows artificial intelligences having been now highlighted far more than some of the other important technology changes, like technology for quantum sciences and robotics. But artificial intelligence is, as we know, a very burning topic now, and one which has very rapidly become important in the G statements. So there's, as I say, many trends. Across those 42 themes, there are many correlations. We can see themes which do appear first in the S statements and then very rapidly translate into the G statement. And then if you look at the data, there's also some variations in terms of one preceding the other. In parallel, there are some very high priority statements, which are clearly deeply embedded in the minds of the policymakers. So that's where the S and the G discussions run parallel. There are some where the scientists have talked before, for some time before the G20. So, for example, the neglected tropical diseases is one of those. There have been some where the S20 discussion hasn't reached the G20 summit discussions. And interestingly enough, neuroscience is one of those. And researcher assessment, which is quite a burning issue for science councils, also hasn't had any impact on the G20 statements. In a few cases, the G20 discussion has preceded the S20, and that has then become something that the S20 group have picked up on afterwards. And that actually is, and artificial intelligence is one of those examples. So that looks like a real miscellany, a whole lot of different aspects of what happens in the science discussions translating into government discussions. The S statements have a dual role there. They are horizon scanning exercises, and they also respond to the policymakers asking for evidence and stimulating public discourse. So both of those work. The S20 statements can be a highlight to inform, or they can pick up from questions and then provide evidence to inform policy. So that's the way the S20 themes are listened to. But the number of them has grown very substantially in recent years. And the point about it, I think, is that there is recognition that the academies are well positioned to use their credibility to act as influence on policy outcomes for the G7 and G20 summits. So the answer to that question that my colleagues say, oh, well, I'm not sure, is actually quite a lot of what we talk about does get discussed in the G20 environment as well. The outcomes of this year, of course, will be a report that we will provide, that ASAF will host. And it is really about scientists listening to each other and all the parties who are attending, and then addressing the policymakers and the science community and the public and the media. So we offer solutions. We hope to build trust. We are working towards a research agenda for the future and looking for new opportunities. And that's what the S20 seeks to do. The S20 communique will come out. It will be evidence-based. We hope it'll add value. It will be inclusive of very many different opinions because of the international nature of science. And it will have some focused themes and provide potential recommendations for action. Human health is one of the lenses this year. It's looking, we have a theme this year for the S20 of well-being and climate change. And human health is at the center of that. And so there's discussions on things like biodiversity and different elements of well-being, recognition of One Health, and looking at the social aspects of well-being and how that relates to climate change. So we have already had some discussions around the human cost of climate change, the impact of climate change, and what is well-being, excuse me, and looking for definitions that we can relate. we are hoping, and what we can do now, is to make sure that whatever we put into our reports and communiques contain facts which are understandable and accurate, provide evidence-based information, which can then be believable, allow formulation of reasonable expectations, and determine what is going to be our options for the future. So it's about creating awareness and understanding and providing reasons for people to trust the information and to trust those of us who are providing it. And one of the keys here is the first line here, facts which are understandable and accurate. And here's another quotation: the scientist of all people is under an obligation to write, not only so that they may be understood, but so that they cannot be misunderstood. And that's where we are with the S20. We need more education, more awareness, and we need to provide scientifically sound information to the public and to our policymakers. What we don't need is disinformation, propaganda, fake truth, overloads, denialism. And of course, we're seeing another wave of that at the moment. But this quotation comes from Professor Jonathan Jansen at the time of the COVID issues around evidence-based knowledge and the discussions about vaccines. And I think we probably did fairly well in terms of providing information, but there was a great deal in terms of lies and misinformation, and it did create enormous problems then, and it will do again if we allow it to. So now turning to the future very briefly, and in particular the impact of digital technologies, we now have the next round of opportunities. We need to make sure that we are managing our research data, because it's becoming increasingly important that we do manage it. And of course, publicly funded research information needs to be accessible. So we need systems for managing our research data so that we can translate it responsibly. We've got new technologies coming, which are posing very new questions. Artificial intelligences, I don't need to go into the detail of all of the different questions at this stage, but we do need to think about how we ethically allow AIs to be used or to do research, and how our students are going to deal with that, and what are they going to learn? Will they learn, or will they simply fall into the traps of believing whatever they see? So what do we need now? And what do we need for the future? Well, I've mentioned trust. I think that's critical. As scientists being listened to, we need to build trust. We need also systems for effective communication of risk, awareness of disinformation, and strengthening the role of official sources. Those scientists who represent the sector and who represent government policies, they need to have a role which is strong and trusted. We also need communication strategies to make sure that what we provide is evidence, fit for purpose, flexible, nuanced, and to counter stigmatization and make sure that all of this is accessible. This, of course, came out a great deal in the pandemic, but it's never been more true than it is right now, where we have people in the public sector uncertain as to what to believe, who to believe, and which organizations they should be trusting. So we have an opportunity now to be innovative about our communication. Science is changing, data is changing, technologies are changing, artificial intelligences are becoming very predominant. Open science is a trend. The awareness that what we have as results should be open to the public, largely because the public often pays for it. But the public need access to what we are doing, and we need to be using the open access routes to provide that to the public and to our policymakers. And we also do need to, as scientists, engage with communities, regional communities, government role players, and therefore, we are at a point where there's nothing more important than the communication of the evidence that we have, which means we need to engage as scientists and express our opinions based on our evidence, involve ourselves in conversations. And what is very evident now is that people are interested in what we have to say. They're interested in what our opinions are. The responsibility lies on our shoulders. So as researchers and leaders, our role is to enable and to inform. We must be able to provide our scientific communities, or at least we must enable our scientific communities to identify value, appreciate high quality ethical standards. We need to communicate all of that. And we have to enable our colleagues, our partners, our stakeholders, including our leaders and our public, to evaluate for themselves the integrity of our research, and then to believe it and to use it. So thank you. I think that sums up my view of where we are in terms of communication. And I think the bottom line, when you think about all of that, is that there is an enormous amount of evidence, and that we as scientists need to be responsible for communicating that to whoever needs to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a very interesting talk, and especially the fact that this comes directly from the S20 meetings. Now, I open the floor for questions. Are there any questions for Stephanie? And while people are thinking about that, I'll ask you one or two. And now, first of all, is there a feeling in the expert community that it would make sense to have supernatural credible groups of experts, so that the governments and the public would have reliable global expertise rather than groups of experts subordinated to the interests of a particular country? I remember at the time of COVID, different countries, different groups of national experts offered totally opposite recommendations. Now, American or the Fauci said one thing, Swedes recommended something totally opposite. South Africa was confused, didn't know what to follow. Shouldn't there be some kind of a supranational group that would be an ultimate source of expertise?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. And, to some extent, the World Health Organization in that context did provide some of that role. And I think any international forums, discussion groups, do provide some common ground. And scientists, by their very nature and by the nature of our work, are often international players. We don't limit ourselves to being only active in our own countries. We all have international communities. But I think the difficulty is in getting the message across. If we are able to get a message across, for example, between our international groups and the international policymaker groups, well, then we will have had some successes. But there are many different, as you say, agendas. And I think what we can do is to aim for providing international or global evidence, global information to as wide a group or as many different groups as we possibly can. It's not simple, and there are, of course, other contexts. I said right at the beginning of this, there are regional and political contexts, which mean that although the evidence may be there, the information may be provided, there are other constraints, which mean that governments don't necessarily all take the same decisions about their responses.
Right. Do fundamental sciences make their way to the discussions in the S20, or are you confined to practical issues, to applied issues?
No, in fact, the S20 meetings that I've attended, we've called them thought leaders. people who are experts in particular fields, who are, I'm hesitating about the word fundamental because that means many things to many people, but people who are scientific experts are often invited to give addresses, presentations on the science that they are expert in to the group. And of course, you have a mixed group, the people who are experts in different aspects of or different scientific topics come in to talk, but there is certainly attention paid to scientific evidence. And those thought leaders then do lead the thinking to some extent in the discussion. But you have a very varied group, so you don't necessarily have the fundamental leaders in those meetings.
Right.
Has his
Any
hand up.
questions?
Mike, I knew you would ask a question.
Stephanie, thank you. That was superb talk, and congratulations to everyone involved in these initiatives. You ended your talk by saying nothing is more important than us communicating our results and analyses. But what we need to think about is what is the best way to communicate them to the public. We need to think about what do the public not read. They don't read scientific papers or scientific journals. They don't read government reports. They do read some social media and newspapers, including online newspapers. But I've noticed that the printed media, their coverage of science in recent years is much less than before. There are virtually no science journalists left in South Africa. And what scientific reporting doesn't come into the papers is usually from Reuters, some international press release. So we have a serious problem in communicating science to the public in the way through the media that they normally use. And I'd like to hear your comment on that. And then also to make the comment, let's recognize the role that science centers and museums can play as an interface between the scientific community and the general public, because I don't think that avenue is sufficiently used in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, I hear you about the difficulty of communicating, and of course, the big change, or one of the big changes, has been social media. Particularly during the COVID time, but also now, I'm very aware that the social media do, to some extent, overcome what is the printed word, if you like. But there is, in many cases, a report behind whatever is made a comment in the social media. So if you think about what used to be Twitter, what is now X, some of our experts post on those social media and they refer to a meeting or a discussion or a piece of evidence. And I think that that's the different way in which the public is receiving information. So what is important is that those social media articles should be backed by the real evidence, I think. And I think we as scientists need to pay attention to that. The example I used of Peter Johnston, the climate scientist, people will go to the YouTube recordings of those kind of interviews and listen to them again because they're available. They're available from your laptop. So that then provides information. So the critical part is that when we do broadcast, present, talk about what we have in evidence, that we make it available and make the public aware that information is available. And just to comment on the science centers, I agree, Mike, that it would be great if we could have more of those. But I think because of the way we live, what we really need is to have virtual science centers or access to what is in the science centers and museums online, because that's where our children are getting their information from. That's where our public are getting their information.
I see Doug has his hand up. Doug.
Doug, go ahead.
Thanks, Igor. A question about the extent to which you are experiencing pressure to the level of misinformation from interest groups and what strategies you've developed to handle that.
Well, let me not speak as an individual. Let me speak representing academies and groups of academies. I think that we do constantly remind ourselves that what we talk about and what we present has to be evidence-based, and at the heart of any scientific discussion is to go back to what do the results say? What does the research tell us? What evidence do we have? What data do we have? And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that whatever we talk about is based on ethical access, ethical information, and to speak out about misinformation. It's difficult to do that. If you take a look at the discussion right now about things like vaccinations, research on health and so on, all we can do is stand by our belief in the data that we have, and the evidence that we have. And I don't think we have an alternative to that. Where we see misinformation, I think we have a responsibility to speak out and correct it. But what we should be doing is being aware of any pressure, I think, to in some way bend the truth. For us, the truth is everything. If we don't maintain truth in our science and our research, then it doesn't have value. I think that's what distinguishes scientists.
Right, thank you. Stephanie, you mentioned researcher assessment at some point. What was that?
That's a discussion which is going on in the international network. So the International Academies Partnership, the International Science Council, there's a discussion about how you, let me try to say this clearly. It's assessment of the standing of scientists. So we know that although they're not particularly favored, we have ranking systems for institutions, and we have kind of rating systems for individuals. And the assessment part of that is a discussion as to how we should be rating, if you like, scientists with a view to things like promotions and recognition, and how we know whether somebody is a leader in their field. So whereas previously we had really relied almost entirely on citations to say what is the standing of an individual, in fact, there's more discussion now around what is the impact of the science that those researchers are conducting. And impact is one of those words that can mean many things to many people. So the discussion about researcher assessment is about looking at how do we rate the standing and the quality of individuals or groups of scientists when we are trying to take into account not only the academic citation base, but also what impact are they having? What difference is their science making? That's the discussion. I don't have all the answers, but that's the discussion about researcher assessment, is how do we know what impact, how do we measure impact, and therefore the importance of what the science is that is being done.
Right, so the discussion is basically about the criteria.
Yes, yeah.
Right, any other questions for Stephanie? Well, if not, Stephanie, thanks very much once again. It was extremely informative talk from the first hands. It's a very rare opportunity. Thank you so much. And thanks very much, everybody, for attending. And I'll see you all on the 18th of June at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
And bye-bye.